The drama surrounding this fight had been building for months, the kind of tension that only comes when two undefeated fighters, both convinced of their own destiny, finally agree to share a ring. Gervonta, Tank Davis and Ryan Garcia had circled each other in the public eye for years, two young stars from different corners of the sport, each backed by promoters who understood the value of patience and spectacle. When the contract finally landed at 136 pounds, a weight both men had to fight to make, the boxing world understood this was no ordinary crossover bout. This was a genuine collision of styles, ambition, and unbeaten records, and from the opening bell it was clear that neither man intended to blink first. The first round unfolded with the kind of caution that experienced fighters reserve for opponents they respect and fear in equal measure. Davis, working from the southpaw stance that had confounded so many before him, flicked his jab out to measure distance while Garcia mirrored his patience, unwilling to be the man who made the first costly mistake. Neither fighter wanted to open the door to the kind of power that had built both of their reputations, so the round settled into a quiet chess match, all footwork and feints, both men refusing to plant themselves in front of the other's hardest punches. Garcia's jab found the mark a handful of times, sharp reminders that he had come to fight rather than survive, but there was a watchfulness in both corners that spoke to just how much was at stake. This was not a fight either man could afford to lose, and that knowledge hung over every exchange. It was Garcia who broke the stalemate first, stepping into the second round with a clear intention to make Davis uncomfortable early, exactly as the pundits and scouts had predicted he would need to do. He pressed forward with genuine purpose, landing right hands and left hands that pushed Davis toward the ropes, and for a moment it looked as though the underdog narrative might hold true, that Garcia's speed and length could keep the naturally heavier puncher on the back foot. Davis, however, has never been a fighter who panics under pressure. He used lateral movement to slide along the ropes, refusing to be cornered, while Garcia worked to cut off the ring, a skill that had served him well throughout his career. There was holding, there was grappling, there was the sense of two proud fighters refusing to give an inch of psychological ground, and then, in an instant, everything changed. Davis ducked beneath a left hook, planted his feet, and unleashed what could only be described as a missile strike. The punch landed clean, and Ryan Garcia hit the canvas for the second time in his professional career, a gut punch to everything his camp had built toward this fight. It was the single outcome the Garcia corner had feared most, the exact vulnerability that had been whispered about in every pre-fight breakdown. Davis followed the knockdown by continuing to land, a left hook through the guard, another shot that found its target as Garcia tried to reset his composure. There was a warning embedded in that sequence for anyone paying close attention. Garcia had been pressuring well, keeping busy with his jab, but the moment he overcommitted, the moment he forced something that simply was not there, Davis made him pay with interest. That is the tax power punchers collect from fighters who forget themselves even for a heartbeat. To his enormous credit, Garcia did not fold. He absorbed the knockdown, rose, and continued working, landing a left hook to the body that reminded everyone why he had been considered a legitimate threat coming into the fight. Davis, ever the technician, showed off the subtler side of his arsenal, faking with his right hand before committing to it only once he saw a genuine opening, a pattern of restraint and explosion that echoed the counter-punching wizardry of Floyd Mayweather Jr., the very trainer who had once mentored him. As the third round wound down, Garcia found himself backed into a corner, firing off combinations before pivoting away, drawing on memories of his own career-defining knockout of Luis Alberto Lopez in 2020, the kind of highlight reel moment that had made him a must-watch attraction in the first place. But something had shifted. The fight was being fought on Davis's terms now, and Garcia's signature left hook, the very punch that had built his reputation, was no longer landing with any consistency. Without that weapon in regular rotation, Garcia's offensive identity began to blur, and the deeper concern for his corner was obvious. If Davis refused to overextend, the check hook that Garcia relied on would never materialize, because that punch depends entirely on an aggressor walking onto it. The middle rounds told a story of a fighter attempting to solve a problem that refused to be solved easily. Davis began to test the waters with his own hooks, probing for the same kind of home the left hand had found for Garcia earlier, while commentary from ringside noted that Davis had won the foot battle decisively, positioning himself exactly where he wanted to be, releasing his hands only when the moment called for it. He was, in every sense, a power-punching counter-puncher operating at the peak of his craft, patient enough to wait, explosive enough to punish. Garcia still believed, and belief matters enormously in boxing. He clung to the idea that his moment would come in the 7th or 8th round, a prediction his own team had made publicly before the fight, a promise that Davis would eventually crack under the volume and eventually go down. There were flickers of hope for Garcia's supporters throughout the 5th round, moments where his hands came alive and his feet found rhythm, a marked improvement from the version of himself that had once struggled to keep his guard high against Luke Campbell, back when Eddie Reynoso was still in his corner. Under new trainer Joe Goosen, Garcia had visibly grown, and that growth showed in flashes, right hands that caught Davis clean, moments that represented, by ringside consensus, some of Garcia's best work of the entire fight. It was a reminder that this was not a mismatch, not a sacrificial event dressed up as a superfight. Garcia had the tools, the timing, and the pedigree to make this competitive, and for stretches of the contest, he did exactly that. Context matters in moments like these, and the broadcast team offered plenty of it as the rounds ticked by. Davis had been in the ring as recently as January, defeating Hector Luis Garcia in what many considered a tune-up before this far bigger challenge. Ryan Garcia, for his part, had turned down an easier final tune-up fight, choosing instead to wait for what he called the biggest fight of his life, a decision that spoke to both his confidence and his hunger to prove himself against the very best. That willingness to skip the safe route and step directly into the fire only heightened the emotional stakes of every round that followed. By the halfway point, unofficial scoring had Davis ahead 58-55, a lead built primarily on the second-round knockdown and his generally sharper output, even as Garcia's spirited 6th-round comeback with the right hand kept things from turning into a total runaway. Then came the 7th round, and with it, the ending that so many inside the sport had quietly feared and predicted in equal measure. Davis, patient as ever, waited for Garcia to commit, and when the opening arrived, he did not hesitate. A dynamite left hook landed clean, one of the few moments all night where that particular punch had truly connected for either fighter, followed immediately by another left hook and a thudding right hand. The combination folded Garcia, forcing him to take a knee, and as the referee's count climbed toward 10, there was a haunting historical echo in the air. Ryan Garcia's own promoter, the legendary Oscar de la Hoya, had once suffered a similarly paralyzing defeat, stopped by Bernard Hopkins after absorbing a body shot whose effects arrived with a delayed and devastating reaction. Now, decades later, de la Hoya was watching from ringside as his own fighter experienced something eerily similar, stomped, in the words of the broadcast, by a Gervonta Davis who had called this exact outcome before the opening bell ever rang. The finality of it was almost cinematic. Davis improved to a perfect 29-0, his 27th victory coming by way of knockout, a number that cements his place among the most feared punchers of his generation. For Ryan Garcia, the defeat marked the first loss of his professional career, and it arrived in the most public and painful fashion imaginable, broadcast to millions who had spent months debating whether speed and youth could overcome power and experience. What the fight ultimately proved was something boxing has taught its fans again and again across generations. Talent alone does not guarantee triumph. Discipline, patience, and the willingness to wait for the perfect opening are just as decisive as raw ability, and on this particular night, Gervonta Davis possessed all three in greater supply than his talented but ultimately overwhelmed opponent. In the aftermath, the questions began almost immediately. Would Ryan Garcia rebuild from this setback the way so many great fighters have rebuilt from their first loss, using the pain as fuel rather than letting it define him? Would Gervonta Davis now find himself even more isolated at the top of the lightweight and super lightweight divisions, with fewer and fewer opponents willing to step into the ring against him? And what does this result mean for the long-term trajectories of two fighters who, before this night, had both been marketed as the future faces of the sport? Those are the conversations boxing fans will be having for months to come, and they deserve to be had together, in the comments, in the debates, in the endless what-if scenarios that make this sport so compulsively watchable. So here is the question worth putting to you directly. Did Ryan Garcia gamble in choosing the biggest fight of his life over a safer